by nature, it is a communal aspect. Now, we live in a very hyper-individualistic Western society that likes to make everything about me and Jesus, but reality check, that's not the world of the biblical authors, like straight up. It's just not.
Well, people in America are leaving church in record numbers, and Tom Rainer thinks he knows why. Well, today I am joined by my friend and host of the New Evangelical podcast, Tim Whitaker, to look at an article outlining the reasons that Rainer gives for this decline. Tim, welcome to Dealing with Deconstruction.
Hello. Thank you for having me, Tim.
I know. Well, you have an awesome name. Let me just start with that, right?
Thank you. That's so kind.
So before we get to this article, which I think was a good article, tell our audience a little bit about what you hope to do with your podcast.
Yeah, I mean, the New Evangelicals is a nonprofit organization, and one of the things that we do is a podcast. And the goal of the podcast is to help push the church forward as we address key cultural issues of our day, and maybe rethink them in a way that looks different and sees things differently than how our evangelical tradition kind of told us to see them.
Yeah. Well, and I think some of that will hopefully play in, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to discuss this article with you, to kind of the 10 things that Rainer says. So let's go ahead and just jump right into this article and talk about these. You can kind of give your perspective. I'll give my perspective, because I think we probably agree on a lot, but we might have some, nuances and some differences here and there. And I'm totally welcome to discuss some of those. So let's go ahead and get to this article.
I'm in.
So, all right. So the first one says that people got out of the habit. All right. So that's his first thing. So in your assessment from people that you talk to that maybe have stopped, going to church, what are your thoughts on they just got out of the habit?
Definitely can be true, for sure. That's absolutely a reason that people or churches have lost attendees. I mean, COVID was a moment for sure that I think reset a lot of people's expectations and habits. And I think for a lot of folks, they thought, well, this church thing maybe isn't really all it's cracked up to be, or maybe they just thought, I'd rather have my Sunday mornings to meet my family or just to myself, and didn't go back. So it's definitely plausible for sure.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think sometimes even to the rise of, the online church spaces, people are existing more in online spaces. And so the idea of like having to go to a physical church building, yeah, I can see how they would get out of the habit. Now, again, I wish that they wouldn't have gotten out of the habit. What are your thoughts on that real quick before we move on?
Well, I'm not sure how much your audience knows about me, but as an individual, I have some pretty different views on church than I think the average evangelical. And I've had them for a long, long time, but I'm not surprised at this at all, because when you build church structures on sugar and on high event and lights and whatever, or out of obligation, a sense of if you don't attend, you're not really doing what God wants you to do. I expect that people at some point will break free from that, or realize that maybe the Sunday morning event wasn't full of nutrients. It was just a sugar rush. And so what good is it serving me in the middle of a pandemic? I mean, COVID, I think on my end, really reinforced the problem with the evangelical church complex. I'm speaking broadly. That term is not the easiest to define, but I'm talking about mainline, like Assemblies of God type vibe, right? Or the more modern Baptist church or more Reformed church that's maybe singing the classic worship tunes that we're all aware of, right? That kind of vibe. I was really hoping that when COVID happened, that the church would adapt and go into like a home group model, because you can easily meet with one or two people at your home, still follow COVID guidelines, and also give people that sense of community. Unfortunately, we saw the culture shift towards a place of, we need more live stream equipment. We have to broadcast what we're doing on Sunday on Facebook. And that was a losing proposition on a number of levels. On a technological level, on the fact that, sorry, Pastor, you're just kind of boring when you preach, and hearing you through Facebook is even more boring. And then also, like, you lost a sense of community, right? Like who's in my actual life? Who gives a shit about, can I host on your podcast? Sorry. I mean, who gives a shit about me? I don't care about singing these songs from the comfort of my own home, my pajamas. I need people in my life during a pandemic. So I think that the church really missed that. And then, and so I'm not surprised to see that people got out of the habit and stopped going. And again, that's only one reason. People get older, etc. But yeah, I'm just not surprised.
Yeah, no, again, and I would echo a lot of what you just said. That I do think that those things that you just mentioned do kind of play a role in that kind of the sugariness that we are often giving people in the church space. And again, I think there's conversations that we can have around how much lights and how much production that we could have or need to have or whatnot. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. So let's jump to number two. Number two, this one is kind of near and dear to my heart. They left after they graduated from high school. And the reason I say that it's near and dear to my heart is I worked for several years in a college ministry where we were trying to create small groups on college campuses to be able to address maybe some of the questions that came up in colleges. Students would exist in a bubble, and like an evangelical bubble, and they wouldn't be taught things that were kind of outside of their worldview. And then they would go to college and they would meet their first, Muslim, or they would meet their first atheist biology professor, and they were kind of told those people are bad and stay away from them and don't listen to what they have to say. And now they're being asked to sit under their tutelage as a student, and that sometimes rocked their world. And so what the organization that I had worked for several years, I don't anymore, did was provide a small group space for people to bring those questions and be able to ask them and then kind of work through them. So what is your thoughts, Tim, about people leaving the church after they graduate from high school and maybe head off to college?
Well, I'm definitely I have a lot of issues with these like follow-up paragraphs that this author put of like the reasons why. There's a lot. Again, I want to just clarify. There's no singular reason to any of this, right? Like it's all complicated and it's all nuanced, right? So with that in the back of our minds, I think some themes we can pull out of this, statement that they decided they didn't like institutional church. I'm sorry. Wait, I'm sorry. You're number two, right?
I'm on number two. Yeah.
My bad. I was looking at the wrong one. They left after they graduated from high school. My bad. Same thing though, really, because it's just an age difference in my mind. I mean, this is again another. What's interesting to me is that, and this has been a critique of mine, even when I was still very much steeped in and part of the evangelical consciousness in America, is that the church has an inability to look in on itself and reflect on its own problems and shortcomings and asking, why is this happening? They tend to blame everyone else but themselves. Oh, it's the world, it's the liberals, it's college, it's the elites, without actually realizing like, well, if your theology is a mile wide and inch short, maybe you're just giving people really bad theology that doesn't face up to that doesn't stand up to legitimate scrutiny, and also a very narrow theology that can't make room for people seeing the world differently without them potentially being sent to hell to burn for all of eternity. So I think a lot of people, especially high schoolers, right, they're kind of given these really oversimplistic answers to a lot of really complicated questions that humanity has been wrestling through since the beginning of humanity. Right. And they go to, their freshman class. It could be even a Christian institution, around Old Testament 101. And they go, wait, it's not all supposed to be taken literally. Oh, wait, the laws actually contradict themselves. How we view the word law is different than how the Israelites viewed the word law. Whoa, what do you mean? So, I'm just not surprised by this, but I look at the source, not so much like I'm not looking at what happens downstream. I don't blame the professor for doing their job. I put a lot of scrutiny underneath the churches that have given people a really flimsy foundation that feels so secure and confident until it gets asked real questions. And then those people are like, oh, these are actually better answers than the ones I've been given. So I want to clarify for me, people say all the time to me, oh, I wasn't allowed to ask questions in my church. And I say, well, I mean, maybe for you that's true, but for me, I was allowed to ask all kinds of questions. I had to arrive at their answers. I had to arrive at, no, eternal conscious torment is the only way to view hell. No, a literal Adam and Eve is the only way to view Genesis 1 and 2. So my issue isn't that churches don't allow for questions. They do. As long as you arrive at their conclusions, you're safe. But if you go outside of their view of those things, you're in danger.
Right. Well, and I think what you just said, kind of the mile wide, inch deep kind of thing, plays into this next one. And you kind of alluded to this, that they decided that they didn't like the institutional church. So you're saying some of the follow up paragraphs, maybe have, play into kind of your not liking this one as much, or maybe identifying with, or even changing some of his nuance to it. So talk about that just for a second.
Oh yeah, I mean, and again, I like qualifying my statements because they are always taken out of, you're so extreme. But I'm sure Chris would, or the author of this article, I think his name is Chris. I think he would agree with me when I say this, but he didn't mention it. He says in that second paragraph, but if the church is an institution and a family, is it a right answer to then abandon loyalty to family because of dislike of institutions? That's just a very oversimplistic statement for me. I'm not aware, at least in my line of work, answering probably close to 10,000 DMs over the past 2 years. I had never met anyone that's like, just because something is an institution, I don't like it. It's usually what that institution does with their power that becomes really harmful and dangerous and problematic. And frankly, this whole talk of family, I think for a lot of people, we grew up in that language, but it's left wanting. Does family abandon its own when they change their views on theology? My family didn't, but my church did. So is this a one-way street? I mean, why is family only assigned to me when I have an issue, but not to them when they're concerned about me in a way that really they don't have to be concerned about, right? And also, this fails to address the fact that especially evangelical churches, and this is ironic because I believe Lifeway is a subsidiary or part of the SBC. Institutional churches have abuse histories. The SBC in particular came under serious scrutiny and fire for hiding decades of SA, right? Of abuse.
Yeah.
Right. And so, maybe it's a little more complicated than just, I don't like institutions. Maybe it's the fact that someone might have been legitimately assaulted by their pastor, that was covered up, or the pastor was moved to a different church and the survivor is left on their own to pick up the pieces, right? So it's much more complicated to me than just they don't like institutional church. What are the reasons they don't like institutional church? Because I will tell you, it takes a lot of guts and a lot of effort to say, this was my family for over a decade and now I'm leaving it behind. Something has to really go wrong for someone to do that.
Yeah. Well, and again, the next one that we'll get to in a second is that they were hurt by the church, which I think you and I can both share, several stories about. But I'm trying as best I can to maybe steel man this number 3 about the institution. And sometimes, as an artist, you're an artist, I'm an artist. I think I would look at that and be like, if it's something is run by engineers and it has lots of policy and it's very type A and people want it, to fit in very specific boxes, that can be very restricting for a whole, group of people that like to kind of just push those boundaries, not even necessarily, incorrect or heretical theological boundaries, which again, we can talk about that, but even just the way that things have to be done. For example, a church that I was at one point, they had a very strict policy that if you want to be a small group leader, you had to go through this very precise institutional thing, right? There's a whole year of coaching and all these classes you had to take in order just to be a small group leader. And so I left scratching my head. It's like, well, I've gone to school for, I have an associate's degree in religion and I've been an apologist for a long time and I've studied. And so why do I still, and I was a small group leader at several other churches. I've been on staff at several churches. Why do I have to still go through this very laborious, very long process in order to be able to continue a small group leader? So to me, when I hear people leaving the church because of the institutionness of it, that's kind of where my head goes as well. But I think you're exactly right that sometimes the institution can definitely cause a lot of hurt.
It's funny you say that because I would land on the opposite of that. I'm like, oh, your church had a really intense process for their small group leaders? That's great. That's amazing. Then they can really filter out people who just want to lead people who don't know anything versus people who actually are involved and invested, right? So it's just interesting to me because I think that, like, if there's one thing I've been more convinced about, who we have teach people about the Christian God and the Bible really matters, because we're talking about some really complicated, like, and for our own context, out of this world thing. And to have, Bob, who's like an accountant on the weekends, lead a small group talking about the theology of whatever, the cross or something. It's like, well, you wouldn't trust me to run your clients' numbers, and you don't want to trust me on that. And maybe we shouldn't trust you to talk about something that, like, takes a lot of work and training to really think about critically without also giving people unhelpful ways of thinking about God. So to me, it's interesting. So I'm like, I think that's great. Right.
Well, yeah. And I mean, again, it could be, but some people could be like, I'm out because of that. Like, they would just abandon the whole process,
Totally.
the whole idea of church because of, the red tape or whatnot.
Yeah,
so
that's
yeah. So yeah, let's maybe we'll camp on this one for a little bit. They were hurt by the church, and so for anyone that knows me and knows my story on my channel, that I have a long history of church hurt in my past, which I've talked about. I even preached about it this weekend at my church. We're doing a series called Dysfunctional Church through First Corinthians. I got the privilege to speak on 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and, kind of shared some of the stories that I have. So I can totally understand where people are coming from. I think one thing that I would caveat, and I want to hear your thoughts on this well, is that, if it's true that Jesus walked out of the grave and God rose him from the dead, I can see not wanting to be around some of those people. But for me, I was hurt by the church, and because of the truth of Christianity, because of the truth of Jesus walking out of the grave, is why I still, love and serve the church. What are your thoughts on this?
Whoa, a lot of thoughts on this one. My friend Dan, I was talking to recently, he made a great analogy. He was like, the reason why church hurt is so damaging, why it really affects people deeply, is because it's like going to a hospital and getting hurt at the hospital. Like, you go to the hospital to get healed, and if you leave worse than you were when you first got there, you really are going to be extra frustrated and hurt about what the hospital did to you, right? Because the expectation is that you will find healing, is that you will find community, is that you will find these things. And I think it's important to realize that there's a difference between someone committing harm to someone and acknowledging that and repenting of it, and that harm being swept underneath the rug and nothing really changing. And so it's not about perfection. It's not about being perfect. It's about being accountable. And the reality is there have been too many examples. I mean, there are truly countless examples, and I follow the news, so I know, of pastors, people in positions of spiritual authority who have positioned themselves as, right, a spokesperson on behalf of God and what the Bible says. So there's a huge power dynamic already at play. And they're telling you, hey, God is telling you to give money to the church. God is telling you to live this way when it comes to maybe your sex life or something like that. God has given me a vision for the future of this church, right? So there's already an inherent connection between that pastor and the divine. And when that pastor is SAing someone, when they have an attitude that is one of a dictator, when they are, gaslighting people, and then those victims and subsequent survivors get the courage to speak up and say, actually, this pastor did this to me. And then the pastor is still kept in that position, or the pastor is sent to a different church with no accountability. Right. And the survivor is usually shamed. Wow. I mean, that is a recipe for it. Talk about, like, you go to the hospital for a headache and you get your leg cut off kind of situation, right? You come out like, what the hell just happened to me? Yeah. So, the person in the author of this article, I think his name is Chris, right? Is that right?
Tom
Tom. Sorry, I'm so bad with names. So Tom, my apologies. He says here, although the reality of hurt from the church exists, Rainer says to remember the reason we come to church in the first place. We don't come to church for the people, we come to church for Christ. I disagree with this. If you were just going for Christ, you could do that in your house by yourself. I don't need people. But no one agrees that the ecclesia is you by yourself. You're part of a community. You are the body of Christ. Right. So by nature, it is a communal aspect. Now, we live in a very hyper-individualistic Western society that likes to make everything about me and Jesus, but reality check, that's not the world of the biblical authors, like, straight up. It's just not. So I really have found, and I'm not blaming Tom here, I'm not accusing him of doing this, but I have found that people who use that language usually use it as a way to minimize the lived trauma and hurt of real people at the hands of pastors in positions of power. And they say, well, you put too much stock in the community. You were too people focused. But think about what the churches say every Sunday morning. We need volunteers. Join a small group. Get plugged in. Connect now. Find your family. We're a family on mission. The language is all about you finding belonging here. Right. So of course it's going to be utterly traumatic and maybe even permanently damaging in some capacity when a leader or a pastor, commits such heinous things and gets away with it with absolutely no consequences, either legally or from a church perspective.
No, I think you're exactly right. I do think that, I mean, again, we are given very, very serious commands to continue to meet together, that church is a family, as you described. And so, that can be what is so damaging about when that trust that you've put into somebody, pulls that rug out from under you, or abuses you in several different ways. I mean, I follow the Roy's Report, Julie Roy's
Oh yeah.
show, and yeah, I mean, again, sometimes when people are telling their stories, I'm nodding my head along and be like, yeah, that was me. I was in that position, and I identify a lot with what they say. And so what my encouragement would be for people that are in that is find someone to talk to, find a counselor, someone to walk through that with. Know that you're not alone. Again, I've been very honest about some of my church hurt situations and the positions that I found myself in, and feeling that same way, Tim, that you just described, like feeling like, wait a second, this is a family. And that really started my process of kind of questioning, is like, does Jesus see me the same way that these, church leaders see me, to be pushed aside, to just be, kind of pushed down and forgotten about and just trampled on, and, working at all hours, and please don't consider my family at all when you're planning
Right.
events, and I just have to be there, and just no matter what.
Right.
And again, that is a very PG version of what I went through. So I totally get it. I would encourage someone, to have a talk or discussion, or email me, or Tim, if you want people to reach out to you as well. It's been in that situation. Would love to hear some of their story. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just very frustrating that it seems like, and I'm not sure. I'm going to go here. You can edit this part out if you don't like it, and it's your
No.
podcast. But it's very frustrating to see an evangelical culture that is so steeped in culture war rhetoric when they can't even hold their own spaces accountable. Like, I really don't want to hear about protecting kids when every day people like the Roy's Report are sharing stories of pastors who are abusing children and maybe being arrested 10 years later if they're lucky. I don't want to hear from these same people that the queer people out there are the ones who are grooming children. It just becomes this whole thing where the log is so big from their own eye. It's like you don't even see it. So I think a lot of people that I represent, and myself personally, I'm just kind of over it. I'm like, listen, I don't want to hear a darn thing about how concerned you are about whatever you think is out there when you can't even hold your own spaces accountable or make a big deal about it. But instead, too often you minimize it, you deflect, you blame someone else. It's not good.
Well, let's move to number 5. They say they couldn't find a church that meets their needs. So what role, Tim, do you think, people's needs and that way being met? Is this too, capitalistic, consumeristic of us to think that, or should our needs, be considered in that sense?
Yeah, I tend to be maybe the rebel in my own space here. I'm not a fan of this, like, I need my needs met, in the sense of like, oh, how's your children's ministry? How's this? How big is your thing? Like your event or something like that. Humans have needs. We want to belong to something. We want to have community. I think that churches should be able to meet those needs for people who want to find faith and find people that they can do life with. But this idea of like church shopping, I think, is more about it says more about our current cultural moment and just the waters that we're steeped in, more than about like what maybe the heart of church ever was designed to be. At the same time, culture changes, culture moves, and we shift along with it. I mean, I know some people like to pretend that, they're always standing on what they call the biblical, truth of whatever. But like the reality is culture influences how we even talk about that stuff. Right. And that's okay. We can acknowledge that. I'm not a fan of like the consumerism of church. I'm not a fan of like the mega church world. I'm not a fan of like how do we attract, so-and-so with our programs. That being said, for every one of those thoughts, I know many people, including single parents, who found a lot of help in those spaces, right? They needed a church that had a great childcare system and et cetera. So I don't want to knock it a whole lot and sound like a Debbie Downer, but I personally am not someone who's like, yeah, church is all about just you, more of you, and everyone else damned. Can be damned. It's just it's not the right way of thinking about it, in my perspective overall.
Yeah, and again, I think that there is a balance here, and even number 6, we can tie this one in. It says that they had a need and felt the church didn't meet it, and I think that goes a lot to what you're saying. Is that there are some parents maybe that are struggling. We have a family in our church that I think about when this comes up, and yeah, we want to be able to try to meet their needs. Or if you've lost a job or you've been hurt by the church, there is something there that the community on some level, as the bride of Christ, should be able to to come alongside you and bear that burden with you. And when it doesn't, that can add to that church hurt. But I would say if you're in a church that is loving, that does care for you, that has some of these programs, and is again theologically correct, and maybe that's where you and I would disagree on maybe what falls into that category of theologically correct. I think you're in a good spot. Now again, I wouldn't tell somebody to stay in a spot where they're being abused, or where there's corruption going on, or
Right.
where greed is the primary motive. Yeah, those are not things that we should be kind of hanging around for. But that's kind of where I said that no, we shouldn't be super consumeristic with church and our environments, but we should also, as God called us, that there should be a bearing of one another's burdens. And if that's not being met, if something's being taught that is unbiblical in that sense, then yeah, I think that there is a sense that we should go down to a church down the street. So
Yeah, and I think a lot of this comes down to what is the purpose of church, like meaning like who is it supposed to be meeting? And you could pull from Acts, right, and look at like, okay, like they pulled all their money together and no one had anything in need as a little community, right? I think a lot of my gripe with the modern evangelical church thing that we're a part of when it comes to this kind of stuff is that so much of the resources too often go into like producing the Sunday morning event or the building to sustain the Sunday morning event instead of taking care of the people that the church is supposed to be taking care of. And so I think a lot of people, because preachers can be very persuasive and very gifted communicators, they just have these assumptions that like, oh, God will meet me, and the physical manifestation of that is this church. And then all of a sudden they find it lacking when it doesn't come through for them. There's also another side to this, though. I think it's a little bit stickier for some people to hear, but I think we have to say it. There also is the consumer side of this, right? Like for everyone who is hosting an event, you need people to consume the event. And I think a lot of people have been conditioned by the evangelical church culture, mega church culture, etc., just to become spectators and not like actual radical, my allegiance is to Jesus, kind of people. And so that could be a chicken or the egg situation, like which feeds which. I think at this point I'm more convinced that like the church structures feed the mentality. I'm not sure, Tim, if you saw that video by J.D. Greer that went viral a couple of weeks ago where he was scolding his church for being part of a religious show because they were leaving early, and then all of a sudden the camera zooms out, and it turns out he's in a mega church with like a panning camera and like high end equipment. It's like JD, like I know you're scolding people for being part of a religious show, but also like you're kind of creating the religious show for them to come to, right? So I think that's like part of what I think about too when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, there really is, again, a double-edged sword, and maybe another point we can come back and talk about this, about, how much should the church, what you refer to as the megachurch movement, and again, I'm not exactly sure, but I think I have a pretty good idea of that. Yeah. Like, it came out of, connecting what was going on in culture to the truth of the gospel in a sense, the community that church is, the ecclesia, the body of Christ. And so, again, like you're saying, yeah, well, there's kind of this, is it the chicken or the egg, right? Like, did we need something like that to draw people in? Were we getting too stuffy and sticky and church was, irrelevant? And we can say, no, there are elements of the Christian walk that can go with that. We can have quality music as a congregation, as you and I both know, as we've played in church bands. And we can say that this competes with some of what's out there on a, maybe a secular level of people that are professional musicians. But then on the other hand, how far does that go? Or when does it go too far or something like that? So,
right, and like, is that the point of church? I mean, listen,
right.
I'm still to this day a professional drummer in the secular world now, but I'm not gonna lie, I loved my in-ears and using Ableton and like I loved it in church. Yeah. But is that the point of what the church is supposed to be? Like, is that the call to compete and become a better product than like whatever we think the secular world is? Like, why this dualism, right? So right. I think for me, I ask myself a lot of the same questions, and I think I live in a tension for sure when it comes to answering them.
Well, and again, this may these all kind of a little bit connect as we're talking here. Number 7 is that they never felt connected to church, and so again, as someone that's been in church leadership, one of the things that we would always say is like, well, are you involved? Like, are you serving in the church? Are you in a small group? Have you availed yourself of some of the things that the church has offered with that? But then I also understand, as someone that felt like they were, kind of pushed out and ostracized a little bit. That you try to do those things, you try to be in those spaces and feel like you're not able to connect with other people for whatever reason. What was your experience, being able to connect with people at the church?
Well, I'm naturally a connecting kind of person. Like I'm very, outgoing. I like making new friendships. So I was always connected in my church spaces. I was always part of like the inner whatever it was. I just because
Yeah.
I made it happen. This is another one. Never felt connected in the church, and I think that this is another indictment on this metric problem that evangelicalism has, which really comes out of the church growth movement out of the 50s and 60s. This idea that hey, the more people in your church, the more successful it is automatically. Like just the more numbers we got, the more God's blessing it. Which is really that's a capitalistic measure. Like it's not really a biblical measure for success. Now, people will always point to the Acts church, and hundreds were added to them daily. That doesn't say though, like that was the proof of success. It was the Holy Spirit descending on them. It was them taking care of each other. It was them preaching the gospel, so to speak. It wasn't the fact that they had 5,000 people attending, Elevation Church's Sunday morning worship service. Like, I'm sorry, it's just not a thing. And of course, we both know, Tim, that the context of the biblical world when Paul's writing it's all house churches. Okay, church buildings did not exist till really the time of Constantine. I digress. I feel like when it comes to this is again another fatal flaw of this like bigger and bigger and bigger and this like heavy emphasis on leadership. It almost seems like so much of our church air is meshed in with like this like self-help like leadership like mentality that we kind of see in culture, right? Where like eaters eat last and like you have to lead people well. And that's not bad, right? Like leadership isn't a bad thing to talk about. It's not inherently harmful or anything. You need good leaders to do things. But if someone doesn't feel connected in the church, it's like, well, is it because you're one of these churches where it's like, here's your smorgasbord of things that you can go to, right? And hopefully you can find one. Like it doesn't I don't know. Maybe I'm kind of in over my head here, but in my mind, like the way that church is done in potentially a healthier way than what we're seeing now is Shane Claiborne's idea of smaller and smaller until you take over the world, not bigger and bigger, right? Because by just the fruit of having a mega church of 25,000 people, how does everyone know the one lead pastor? You can't. It's impossible. So right away, you're cutting off the relational side of what a pastor should be doing. How do you shepherd 25,000 people? Or how do you build a team that can shepherd, right? That's usually what they say. But still, a lot of these churches are built around the one person. I mean, I use Elevation a lot, but without Stephen Furtick, Elevation isn't Elevation. Like he is the driver on Sunday morning. He's the draw, him and his band, right? So I just think like the whole system is so twisted that I'm not surprised people don't feel connected. I understand that. It's easy to fall through the cracks because when you're thinking about more everything, you lose the relational aspect of that. And it gets harder, especially for people who tend to naturally fall through the cracks, right? The introverted people, maybe people who have a disability, people who maybe aren't born in America with like a cultural difference. They're the first ones to fall through the crack, right? And those are the ones that the church should be meeting the needs of first. They should be number one on the list. Right. So I'm not surprised again that this is number 7. It makes complete sense for me.
Yeah, no, and I think you're exactly right. Like that Stephen, Furtick model, the mega church modeling, and Stephen Furtick's in my backyard. So there's lots of people that I, bump into that are like, oh yeah, Elevation, great. But I would categorize that a little bit more as like a Jesus marketing agency, more so than biblically described ecclesia. And so I think that's one of the things that kind of, gets us again away from some of these things. And just with lots of this, human nature would tell us that the less connected you are to the people, the less drive and motivation you might have in order to be able to meet with them. And so I think we see that a lot. Now, this next one I think is sticky. I think he's talking a little bit more perhaps about a pattern or something that is going to be an indicator of maybe other things. And the subtitle here, the heading is that they did not give to the church. Now, I can't see that is a reason why people don't necessarily go anymore. Again, I think it can be an indicator that people may be on their way out. And I can think of several reasons why people don't give to a particular church. Maybe they think that church is mismanaged and they don't want them to, manage their money. Maybe they think they're using it for things that they ought not to be using it for. Maybe maybe they just don't understand some of the church teachings on some of that or what the scripture says about that. Or they don't have the financial means to be able to do that. And so I know there's been people, and I've been in the situation where it's been tough to give and to set that money aside. But again, I don't think that people are leaving because they don't give. What's your assessment?
Well, I think that's more just the fruit. Like when you leave somewhere, you just stop giving. Like I think what he's saying is that, and he says it here, this pattern is detectable. Church leaders can have the person with the giving records give them warning signs when people begin to drift. I mean, it's like, yikes. Okay, that's weird. But as a nonprofit, I run a nonprofit. I understand that like you're always kind of keeping track of like, okay, who's donating and who's stopping. I wonder why they stopped. The problem is that there's a difference between a church and a nonprofit, but not in our culture, right? A church is a legal nonprofit, which means you have to get donations in order to make everything work. And when you're trying to build a huge mega something, it takes a lot of money. And that means you have to get a lot of people to give because you can't really sell stuff. You're not a for-profit organization, right? So, yeah, I mean, I personally, I don't see any mandate to give 10%, especially in the New Testament. I think it's not good. I draw more. This is where more of my Frank Viola pagan Christianity roots kind of come through, where I'm like, yeah, if you have a house church, these aren't a problem. If you have no one on paid staff, these aren't big deals. Just aren't. Like flat out. The idea of like the professional clergymen for me is just like, don't need it. Sorry, you don't need it. I would much rather have the professor down the street who's a biblical theologian come in and say, hey, as your tithe, can you just come in like once a month and just teach us something that's like really cool and call it a day? Now, there's more to that. I'm oversimplifying. But yeah.
Trying to put me out of a job, Tim. What are you trying to do here?
I have a lot of thoughts on this stuff. I told you. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a weird one. I don't know if this is like Tom's research, like, hey, based on the data after polling 25,000 people, here's what we found. If it is, I have to accept it and wrestle with like, okay, what does that mean and how did he do all the research?
Yeah.
I'm just not sure if this is more like his thought or like an actual trend that he's seeing. But yeah, again, it makes sense. Like if you're not giving to something you don't believe in anymore, you tend to stop being a part of it a lot of times, unless there's some kind of financial hardship.
Yeah. No, I think it is research that, he did as, I think for his doctorate degree, and I think it's published in a book as well on this. So yeah, so this is coming from a survey, mostly survey data, self-reporting survey data.
Got it.
So yeah, and again, I do want to say, I mean, Tim and I can disagree, and we do disagree, and he said things that I disagree with, and I've probably said several things that he disagrees with, but he's welcome here, and we have a conversation, and people can leave in the comments where they might agree or disagree with whatever. You might have to be specific, because if you say I disagree with Tim, it might be confusing, but that's okay. So I just want to preface that's I'm not charging back on him. This isn't a debate. We can disagree. That's fine.
Well, and for the record, what I'll do is I'll make a video tomorrow on Instagram about how much I disagree with you and how horrible the conversation was. That's kind of my approach.
And that's feel free to do that. That's totally fine. So number 9, they left when the pastor left, and again, I'm trying to steelman these people, thinking that's why they left. But if there was a big, theological kerfuffle, or there was something, there was abuse going on when that person left, then yeah, or if the leadership, which was having issues and causing lots of church hurt and doing things that were completely immoral, ousted a pastor that they maybe shouldn't have, then maybe they should have left. Maybe I can think of some good reasons why people would leave the church when their pastor left. I can think of some really bad reasons why people would leave when the pastor left. And maybe that goes back to that consumeristic thing. Tim, what are your thoughts?
No, I agree. Again, these things are complicated, right? Like there could be 100 different situations where people go. I mean, when I was a kid, I was part of 2 church splits. I don't remember much of the details. I was young, but like some people left and went with the pastor, and some stayed.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the root of this though is what Rayner says. Most of the time, it is just when someone's allegiance is tied too closely to a person rather than to Christ.
Right.
I agree, but also like again, what does the church demonstrate? They demonstrate that a pastor has a vision from God to start a church and should be followed. So my issue isn't necessarily like, oh, I disagree with your assessment. It's like, yeah, but whose fault is that? Again, like if you're teaching people how to be Christian, if you're teaching people what a church is, and this is what you present to them, and this is how you lead, and this is how you teach, and everything is built around you. Are we supposed to be shocked? Like, are we supposed to be surprised when maybe people leave with the pastor who they feel close to? Now, that being said, again, there's all different reasons that this happens. And when people leave because a pastor is problematic and the pastor stays, that can also be damaging, right? Yeah. So I think broadly speaking, they left when their pastor left. I understand how in his research it could be a thing. Like it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Let's jump to the last one here. This is number 10. They moved and never went back. Now, I'll say this: there is a good deal of research, and I can't remember the name of the book, but there's some significant research that came out just recently, within the past couple months, and they said that this is actually the number one reason. It was something like 40% of people that no longer go to church cited that they moved and just never went back. So they, again, I've moved before, and there's habit changes that happen. There's schedule changes when that happen.
Yeah.
There's relationships.
Yeah.
If you were going to church because you kind of had been there for a long time and you had lots of friends, or your family was close, and so you just kind of went with them. I can totally see why being in a new location would cause you to maybe rethink some of your habits. But again, I would just implore people that if your allegiance is, as Tim and I have talked about in this article, to Jesus, and that's something that we're kind of commanded to do as Christ followers, that we should try to find a healthy, thriving church. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. They moved and never went back. I mean, maybe they're, yeah. I mean, I don't really have a ton of thoughts on this one besides, like, yeah, that tracks. Like, that tracks. I'm 35. I have 2 kids under 3. I was told my whole life if I stop going to church, I'll probably drift. My morals will change, and I won't be as filled up. I haven't been to church in 2 years. Um, if anything, statistically, my life has only gotten better, not because of church, but it's like it hasn't changed or gotten worse by any means. It's only gotten better. But I will say, like, and I've told people in my space, this, I miss it. Like, I miss being a part of, like, a community of people who are like-minded in that way. I miss meeting new people. I miss even going somewhere on Sundays. Like, it's been 2 years. I'm kind of like ready to kind of get back into it. I just don't know what it looks like for me yet, because I know where I came from. I don't want to go back to that. I have my values and ideals of, like, the church gathering, but also I want to be flexible. I mean, I used to be someone who's like, the Acts church, we must go back to the Acts church. And one day my friend who was in Bible school is like, but we don't live in the time of Acts. Like, we're just not there, Tim. Like, we're in, like, we're in the year 2000 and something. Like,
Yep.
Culture has changed. We have technology now. Like, okay. And I was like, that's a good point. And I think this is why binaries are so unhelpful, because either, it's all culture, we should always adapt to all the culture, I think is not always the best take, because sometimes culture does really unhealthy, damaging things, right? I mean, I think that consumerism is unhealthy for most people. Mm-hmm. I think it's not good for the planet. I don't think it's good for our psyches. I don't think it's good for, people who are trying to just to make a living, does that mean that we take the consumeristic model and apply it to church? Probably not. At the same time, technology, lights, whatever, modern building codes might all be good things that we take from culture and say, yeah, we should use these, right?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it is using wisdom and trying to think about what is the call of the church? What does it mean to be salt and light to the world, so to speak? And then how do we accomplish that in our local communities as we promote human flourishing for all? Those are big questions. There's 1,001 different answers and even more books written about it, right? And the Christian tradition it's not monogamous in that way. Like, there isn't just one solution. The church has been fighting about it for a long time, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's important just to realize how big this stuff is. But yeah, someone moving away and never going back, it tracks. I mean, think about all the effort. You have to find a new church. You kind of feel awkward in the beginning. Maybe you don't want to talk to anyone, but maybe you do want to talk to someone. And maybe someone's like really awkward and you're just like, oh, this is weird. And then you have to go to someone's house for a small group for the first time and have all this conversation. It's like dating again. Tim, I'm not sure about you, but me and my wife will joke. She'll be like, I don't want to date. Like, if you died, I don't want to go through all of the work of meeting someone and date. I'm like, I get it, bro. Like, I agree. Yeah. So I get why people might move away and be like, I don't want to go through all that work again, man. It's a lot of work.
It is. Yeah, I mean, again, as someone that has moved, was very involved, was employed by 2 of kind of the larger churches in my previous area. Several people, knew who I was. I knew who several pastors and churches were, to kind of, again, pick up and go to a whole another state 500 miles away is a daunting task. Now, again, I had family here that already went to a church, and so that was kind of our first step into that. That was an easy kind of just, okay, we'll go with you to your church. And then after we matured and started meeting some people and kind of talked to some other folks, ended up going to a couple of the churches, and again now I'm a pastor at a church, and that's my full-time gig. So yeah, again, it's a little bit different, but Tim, I do want to say thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. Again, we can disagree. That's totally fine. I love it. And we can have different perspectives on things. If our audience would love to see, Tim back for maybe another topic on something, feel free to leave that in the comments and we'll see if we can try to make it happen. But Tim, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Tim. It was great.
Well, if you enjoyed this conversation, go ahead and click on the link right here, and you will like that as well. And with that, we will meet you next time as we are dealing with deconstruction.